Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Brown People Problems, a podcast where I, Nikita, chat with my guests about what it looks like to navigate life while being brown and really just talk about the unique experiences of brown folks across all domains of life. And for today's episode, I think you guys need to sit down for this one because I'm so excited to be filming this episode. Today, I'm so honored and so excited to be joined by Balli Kaur Jaswal. She is a world famous, widely published, and award-winning author of several books, including Sugarbread, Unlikely Adventures of Shergill Sisters, and my personal favorite, Erotic Stories for Punjabi Women, which was also on the Reese Witherspoon's book club pick, and that's how I sort of found out about it. And I have my copy in front of me too. I'm looking at it and it feels like we're in the same space because I've got my book in front of me. But Balli has been a former writing fellow at the University of East Anglia and has taught creative writing as well at different universities. She also has a Ph.D. in South Asian diaspora writing, and her most recent book, Now You See Us, just hit the shelves last week. I'm very excited to grab my first copy. But welcome to Brown People Problems, Balli. I'm so thrilled and grateful you made some time in your busy schedule for this.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so excited. I remember when I was coming up with a list of who I'd like to invite on the podcast. And I haven't stopped raving about your book for years, obviously. And my partner is just so sick of it because I'm always just constantly raving on about your books. And so he said, well, why don't you reach out to some of your favorite authors and bring them on? Because I have a lot of South Asian female authors that I really enjoy. And I was like, oh, yeah, sure. I'll shoot an email to Balli. And I did not expect a response. I was floored when you responded and said, okay, well, let's talk. So I'm very excited to get into this.
I am as well. I'm really excited to talk to you.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about your journey as a writer. And I know it's probably complex and there were lots of ups and downs, but I'm really curious about what this whole process has been like for you.
Sure. I guess when I think about my journey as a writer, there are two things. There's the journey that I had as a kid who loved to write and not really thinking about publishing, not really thinking about putting my work out there, but just a kid like that very pure journey of like, you find the thing that you love to do and you just want to do it all the time. And everyone goes, get your head out of the clouds because that's all you're doing.
Yeah.
So there's that journey, which started around the same time that I started reading, right? When I started reading, I realized that I also wanted to tell stories. So it felt like it felt like a very natural compulsion. It was a very natural link from one thing to the other. I suppose my journey as a published author began in my 20s. I think I published a few short stories. I guess it started before that when I went to college because I did an undergraduate course in creative writing. But that doesn't necessarily hand you publishing credentials, or you don't come out with a novel usually, but you come out with some skills. You come out with maybe a sense of purpose, like this is definitely what I want to do. And then it's up to you to sort of follow that path and to continue with it. So I just remember thinking, yes, like this is the thing that makes me feel most like myself. It's the thing that feels like home and makes me feel most alive. So that was my journey as a writer. Yeah, that was where it began.
Yeah, it sounds really lovely. I think every author that I speak to, almost everyone was an avid reader in childhood. I don't think I've spoken to anyone who didn't like books or got into reading later on in life.
It would be a very weird thing to get into. Be like a chef who hates food. Like, why would you do that to yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, it sounds like you've enjoyed reading and writing for quite some time. Yeah. I never took a creative writing course in my life, but I've always thought about writing. And I don't know if this is something that you experience, but I think something that comes up for a lot of us is this sense of perfectionism when we're, practicing any art or hobby or any type of creative work, it's like all this pressure to get it right and to have like this
Absolutely.
perfect version of it. And did anything like that come up for you?
Yeah, definitely with other things that I tried. I remember like being like if I tried a sport, which I'm just terrible at, or like any other subject where like if I didn't do well the first time, then it was like, okay, then I guess that's not the thing I'm good at, which is partly a product of, I think, there's something about immigrant upbringing that's a bit of, like, it's almost like we can't waste time. We have to find out the thing that you're good at. Then I also grew up in Singapore, where that's pretty much the school system as well. Like you're on a treadmill, and if you trip, it's like, okay, you get off now. And that's so it was like those two things combined, and I think also just my personality, that I didn't really have much of a growth mindset. I've been learning and thinking a lot about that lately, you know, because in adulthood that certainly comes back to bite you, right? All the stuff that you just gave up on because you were like, oh, I'm not good enough at that, and then all the pressure you put on yourself to do very well at the thing that you actually feel like you're pretty good at. And the disappointment, the devastation of, you know, you fall from very great heights if you happen to fail at that thing in some way. So that's a lot of baggage that we kind of have to carry when we attempt things, I think, that we don't really acknowledge.
Yeah, and we have to unlearn a lot of that now as adults. Right. A lot of these like internalized beliefs and standards, they really get in the way of us being able to explore and live creatively. Because I think as a group, well, as a really big group, South Asians, I think we're very creative people. But I think it gets squashed down by a lot of these like expectations and rigidity. I remember, so I was born in India, but I was raised in Canada. So I like to think I have the best of both worlds. I remember I was in grade 3 in India, and we had art class, and we had to draw this like fruit bowl, right? That standard fruit bowl that everybody has to draw. And I pretty much failed grade 3 art class. I got like a pity pass because my fruits weren't, you know, my oranges weren't an exact specific circle, or my grapes, some were too big, some were too small. Like it didn't look exactly like how the school system thought it should look. And that really put me off of art and drawing for so long. It wasn't until like COVID happened that I decided to, well, I wonder if I'm, you know, any better at art now. And I think it took a lot of work to say, okay, my circles don't have to be perfectly round. Like art doesn't follow rules. It's okay to just be abstract and express.
I can totally identify with that. Yeah. And I think you're right. I think we are actually quite naturally creative, but something about the immigrant mindset, or just, I don't know, something just makes us go, no, creativity, it's a dead end, right? We don't do that. But we're actually, like, we're such good storytellers, I think. We're such good joke tellers. We've got such a great heritage of music and art and, gosh, you know, just history, you know, just knowledge of diversity and different cultures and linguistics. Like we just have so much at our disposal that, you know, as long as you can't professionalize it, and there's a very narrow view of what can be professionalized as well, which is interesting because you can't absolutely professionalize all those things. We're both living proof, right? You can professionalize like the so-called the softer subjects, right? It's a real shame.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of it goes back to just this like colonial trauma, right?
Yeah.
We, as a group, we're so used to being in survival mode, and the only way to survive a lot of that like dynamic, that colonial dynamic, was to excel in these like more traditional aspects, right? Achievement was so much tied to survival. And that now, as children of immigrants, maybe living outside of like South Asia or even within South Asia, but I think we're kind of facing this like privilege now where we kind of get to say, okay, well, you know, this narrative like no longer fits. I don't have to be in survival mode anymore. Right? But I think a lot of it just comes from constantly being on survival. Our ancestors have been in survival mode for like generations.
Yeah. And don't you I mean, I feel like I still have that, like, even though you know, I can survive on my writing, I still feel like I need to, you know, have a full-time job. That's why I got the Ph.D. That's why I teach at university. Like, I'm like, you know, I have to have a real job. Like, this is this silly creative thing that I do. I can't just do this. So it is still ingrained in a certain way. Like I feel like quite guilty about just doing one thing, which is ridiculous.
Yeah, I think that just like goes to show, right? Like how ingrained a lot of some of these beliefs are for us. It's conscious work to keep challenging them and reframing them. Yeah, absolutely. I know fiction and literature, in my perspective and sort of what I've experienced, have not historically been inclusive of stories of like women of color, especially brown women. I grew up on Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew, Enid Blyton. I grew up on all of these classics and they were lovely, but it wasn't until, gosh, I think in my early 20s when I walked into our chain bookstore here in Canada. And I don't even remember who it was, but I saw a brown author and I was sort of taken aback. I was like, whoa, like visually, it felt so sort of like disorienting. I was like, oh my gosh, and this was really exposed to BIPOC authors, right? Brown authors. And I found, some of the other authors like from India. And I wonder if it was something in specific that inspired you to write stories about brown women, brown families, larger Punjabi diaspora.
Yeah, I think I was pretty lucky, similar to you, walking into a bookstore. I think like I just happened to grow up in a time when there were one or two, like it was still pretty scarce, but it was like Indian, South Asian voices were just starting to emerge in the Western literary world, which what was the international publishing world at the time, and those were the people, those were the companies that disseminated all of the English speaking books, right? So here in Singapore, I had never read about the lives of Indian people, and then a book like The God of Small Things comes out, and it blows my mind wide open. And I was like too young to understand it at the time. Like I think I was only like 13 or 14. And then when I was 16, we read it in school, and I remember just like falling in love with the language, and just knowing that like, oh, there are books, that speak to our experiences. Even though I wasn't in India, it was still like, well, these people are close enough. These people have names that kind of sound like mine. These people are eating food that are kind of like mine. And then there was this opening for like short stories by like Jhumpa Lahiri, and like a lot of and like even things that weren't from the South Asian diaspora, but were from like the Asian diaspora, even like the Joy Luck Club by Amy Tan. Like that was groundbreaking. Because I grew up in Singapore, it was majority Chinese. So even that, like just seeing like Chinese culture represented in the Western world, and seeing that tension between mothers and daughters, and that intergenerational stuff, I was like, wow, this speaks so much to me, to my experience. That was really powerful, and that I think sort of opened just the door just slightly for me. And I thought, oh, okay, we can do this, and it was very lucky that opportunity came at that time.
Yeah, I think that exposure and representation, right, is really life-changing.
It's empowering.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't encounter The God of Small Things until high school, and we had to read it too. And I remember it did not click with me. It felt like a drag. But now I love it as an adult. I just don't know if, me at 16, I was in the right sort of like mind frame to really appreciate something like that. But I think, you're right. That was one of my very first exposures to like a South Asian voice.
It's such a powerful one, and a woman's voice as well. Like absolutely. I think most of those books were by women, and that was interesting as well. It was women who had migrated. It was women who had taken on migration as as a professional route, out of India, and then or had grown up in the U.S. and they were writing stories, and so it was like it was two parts of my identity that were being addressed.
Yeah, 100%. And so you feel so like validated, right? And there's something really gratifying about reading something that you see yourself in.
Yeah, it's interesting because there are people, I think people who've never had to grapple with this, with not being represented, don't quite understand it sometimes. Like, some of them do, but like I remember like when I taught at a high school in Australia, we had this like kind of like old boomer
Mm.
colleague, this teacher, an older white man who, like, there was an anthology about growing up Asian. It's called Growing Up Asian in Australia,
Mm.
and most of the kids that I taught were from Asian immigrant backgrounds. Like it was there was a very high density of Asian Australians, and he was vehemently against putting that on the reading list because he said they already know what it's like to grow up Asian in Australia, and I was
Oh my
really.
gosh.
That made me champion the book even more because I was like,
Yeah.
all the more reason to read it because they see their experience reflected,
Mm-hmm.
right, in these stories. And he was like, no, they need to, like, go outside of their experience. It's just like that. Some people don't get the fiction for some people, or narratives are a mirror for some people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
And an important one.
Yeah. Because unless you have some sort of representation of your own experience, it's really hard to envision yourself in that space.
Yeah,
right.
To understand your experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's why with Erotic Stories, it was so gratifying for me. I walked into a bookstore and it actually first came up for me on Instagram in like Reese Witherspoon's book club, and then I walked into a bookstore and to just see a book by a brown female author, not just like anywhere like tucked away in a corner, but on like the bestseller table right there. As soon as you walk in the store, I sort of stopped and I was like, oh my gosh, I must have this, right? It was so gratifying. I didn't even write it, and I felt all the feels at that time. I was just thinking, yes, like we've made it. Yeah, I think that was really lovely because before, when I was growing up, if there was any brown author that I wanted to read, I had to, I don't know, like order on eBay or order like elsewhere or ask my cousin from India to keep the book for me, and I was gonna get it when I came to visit her. So I think I'm just really like appreciating the fact that all of these diverse voices, all of our diverse voices, are so now enmeshed and incorporated into the mainstream space.
It's wonderful.
Yeah. Like I said, so when I was growing up, I hardly came across a lot of South Asian authors or stories, and I'm sure it wasn't a linear journey, but what would you say led you to pursue writing about brown women and brown families specifically, and Punjabi women specifically? I know a lot of your books kind of have that underlying narrative, and I wonder if there was something in particular that sparked that for you.
I suppose it goes back to that old adage of like writing what you know and writing from your experience. And I just felt like you didn't have to stray very far from my home or from my family to find the good stories or the good drama. But then also I'm really fascinated by, like, I suppose, like, worlds that exist within the larger world, or like communities that exist within a larger country. And like Sikhs are, minorities everywhere, right? So in Singapore, we're like a minority within the minority. So like Singapore is like, a very small percentage of Singaporeans are Indian. And then within that Indian minority, there are fewer Sikhs. So it's a way of kind of being like, we're here and we have, our own customs, language, traditions that are different from the narrative that everyone has here of minorities and of Indian people, because we're just so small, we're almost invisible. So that to me was enough to kind of, I wanted to kind of stick my neck out, I suppose. And then I was really interested with the double-edged sword, I guess, of being a woman in our community, where there was this kind of matriarchal respect, or this respect for the matriarchs, and there's a lot of power that Punjabi women have, but then there's also a great deal of marginalization, being a Punjabi Sikh woman. I wanted to explore that. I just thought that tension between tradition and modernity is really fascinating, and it's a real spectrum that I think a lot of women, especially in our generation, like a lot of women kind of swing between, and it's not as easy as pitting one against the other. So I was just really curious about that, and I saw just lots of evidence of that. I saw lots of stories, potential for stories within that.
Yeah, I love that. It's almost like, like your whole life you're doing this market research by right, just being in that space, and you're able to then consolidate a lot of that in your books.
And it's a gift that keeps on giving. Like Punjabi families they never disappoint. There's always more.
There's always
I
more.
was panicking the other day because I was like, oh my God, I think I've written all the things I could write about. And then I was like, no, wait, there's extended family. I was
Yeah.
like, wait, there's
Yeah.
those guys.
Yeah.
There's this
Exactly.
thing. Like, there's always something.
There's always something. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's also part of the reason why I started focusing on just working mainly with women of color and South Asian women, right? In my practice, I'm a therapist. And because when I remember I was looking for a therapist almost a decade ago, I couldn't find anyone who, or like anyone in my area who looked like me or who understood like the cultural nuances, right? And so now catering to that population, I think, like when you said, when you think you've heard it all, just something new comes up. A client will just bring something brand new in and that'll make you just sort of go, oh, well, I had no idea that this is what this looks like. But there's always, I think that like our communities are so complex and our family dynamics, our cultural dynamics are so complex. There's so much variability, right, within all of these cultural groups that you can't make sweeping generalizations about our group.
No, yeah, we're not monolithic. I think that's something that even a therapist outside the culture who has been trained needs to understand, that there's just such nuance and variety and complexity.
Yeah, absolutely. My own experience too, growing up, is very different from my partner's experience as a Sikh man, right? Growing up and just being from different like states, from different communities. It makes such a difference. And I think what I really kind of love in your books is that there's such an intersection of community, intersection of a character's own sort of like mental health, their mental wellness, intersection of class. And so all of these parts of their identities really, like, you have a lovely way of kind of writing about the intersection of all of these different identities. And I think that's what makes like your character so dynamic and so relatable.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I think it comes from that sense of not wanting to pin people down too quickly, not wanting to be like, this character represents this. Because I just think that there's just so much complexity to us. And even more when you're straddling different identities. Even more so when all people are complex, all people have the capacity for growth and for change and multitudes and all of that. But when you add like this thing of like coming from different contexts and having a code switch in terms of language, but also mindset and dressing and all of that, like I think that's just really fascinating. Yeah, it's very interesting for storytelling.
Yeah. I mean, so many children of immigrants, right, really lead double lives. And I loved how you kind of portrayed that in your character in Erotic Stories, Nikki. And I absolutely love Nikki right off the bat, and sort of sneaking a cigarette like here and there. I think she's just so relatable, and I think that's why it's so gratifying to see people like us in literature, in fiction, because it just really validates your experience, it humanizes your experience, and it just makes you feel like part of something larger.
Yeah, it makes us feel visible.
Yeah, it's not isolating at all. Yeah. And then to kind of top that, I loved how you talked about women's sexuality. That's not something that we talk about, like openly in brown communities. Did a whole other episode with a gynecologist where we talk about this. But on top of that, we never talk about older brown women and their sexuality and sexual needs and experiences. And this was such a niche. What inspired you to write about this?
Well, it's not just older brown women. Like, we don't talk about older women. Like, we don't talk about the sex lives or the dating lives or the aspirations of older people. And we just kind of assume that like they get to an age and then they just kind of stop aspiring. They stop having goals. And they stop having sexual desires or any sorts of desires. So I think for me, like, I feel like a lot of my writing comes from a place of deep curiosity. And I had a very deep curiosity since the first time I learned like what sex was. Like, I think I had a very deep curiosity about like, how is it that this is the way that we have all like procreated. Like, this is the way the species has survived. It can't be, because I can barely stomach the thought of my parents doing it, but my grandparent, like my nanny, my daddy, like, no, like they didn't do that. And I remember just being like horrified but kind of fascinated, because then I was like, it kind of gave me a new way of looking at things. I was like, oh, like my nanny, you know, like there's some aspect of her is more sophisticated or more savvy than I thought, because she had to have like done things with a man, you know, that you only saw on HBO. Like, I had this thing. But then as I got older and maybe a little bit more kind of cynical or realistic, I realized as well that like our grandmothers were so young and so naive, or at least mine was, that she couldn't spell her own name. And didn't know her own birthday and stuff like that. How much did she know going into her wedding night as a teenager, basically? How much of it was kind of a surprise to her? Like, how much did anyone even talk about it with her? Or was it like, this is happening to you, this is what will be done to you, and you don't really have much say in it? So I guess I felt kind of sad, and I felt kind of I felt like I really wanted to create a world where these women reclaimed that power for themselves later on in life, you know, and then, you know, and found a way to talk about the other things as well that they had been quiet about, you know, all the other issues that crop up in the book. I do think it starts from there. I think it starts from talking about something quite primal, quite something that's so deeply soaked in shame. Once you start being open about those things, you start being like, you know what, there are other things, there are other inequalities as well that we could discuss, and there are other things that we need to start looking at.
Yeah, I think sometimes we, at least when we're younger, we forget that our parents and grandparents had lives before us.
We're young,
right? So we're young once, you know, they kind of went through like similar like developmental milestones, and you know, sadly, that's like a population that I've never really kind of wondered about or thought about. And I think that book, your book, really got me thinking about the experiences of my grandma.
I remember being at the temple and being like, she did it. That was all in my mind. Was what?
It
blew my mind.
Yeah, I think it does, right? When you come to terms with it, it's like, whoa, it's really kind of like groundbreaking. I think someone like a child first learns that their parents had sex to have them. It's very destabilizing for a moment.
That's a good word. Yeah.
And I don't know if you resonate with this, but for me, I've always noticed this larger narrative around older brown women, more of like a negative like narrative, right? This like negative connotation that comes with being like an older like brown auntie. And sadly, that narrative has often dictated how I see some of the older women. And it was very refreshing to break out of that and really like to develop like some compassion, some empathy, and really kind of humanize them. And I think that's what the book did for me. It really helped humanize older brown women, and really showed them as like dynamic people that are not just these mothers and these grandmothers. They're not just these like matriarchal figures, like they're complex people as well underneath that.
Yeah, who support each other. So I do think that's what brown aunties do get a bad rap for. And sometimes they really play into the stereotype of being, you know, gossipy or like you know, judgmental or whatever. But then there are also ways that they rally together. And in this book in particular, I really wanted the women to save each other and save themselves. Because I think that happens. I do think that the women, because when they get into these groups where they sit together and they talk about things, I mean, I'm sure like if you've been in a room full of like older Punjabi women, when the door is closed and there are no men around, like at a wedding, and they start singing those like really vulgar songs about the wedding night, or they tell really dirty jokes, or they talk about like intimate issues that they're having, you know, like pelvic floor loosening or breast, breast pain or whatever it is, like stuff like that. They start talking, they start supporting each other, and start giving each other tips. Who else is going to do that for them? You know, the men aren't privy to those conversations. The men aren't going to be listening to those things or be comfortable with you know, those conversations. So it's up to the women to kind of, and I think women do that, right? They create this bond, they create the solidarity that's so important, and they're really good resources for each other. So I wanted to highlight those things as opposed to like they're always tearing each other down and they're always working on behalf of the patriarchy to you know, to out each other.
And it was such a refreshing take. 100%. And I know everyone that I've recommended the book to, and as we've talked about it, they've sort of come back with very similar sort of insights, like, my gosh, like, you know, this makes me look at all like the grandmas and the aunties with like a little bit more like compassion and curiosity. Because prior to that, I know a lot of people in my life, sadly, we've kind of just overlooked them. Right, in a way. And particularly for me, I did not grow up with my grandparents around me so much, so it's just, these were some figures that were not really present in my life on like a day-to-day basis. So I just never had to think about them to the degree that someone else would, or their experiences. And that's why I really loved the focus in this book. Which it also makes me wonder, what was the feedback like from the Brown community when you wrote this book? Because I know like in Toronto there was definitely, there were not like stuff on social media, but I think I saw someone once like reading it on a bus, and you know, the title like draws you in. And I think I saw some like boys like across the busway like snickering, like, oh, what is this like girl reading? Like, what is that? And I'm just curious, like, what was the feedback like from the community?
It's really interesting. So I haven't received much direct backlash. I've actually received a lot of really positive messages from men and women. And like the direct messages and comments that I've received from the community are largely positive and across gender and age groups, which is interesting and also really heartening. Maybe 2 or 3 times I've received messages from people on social media, like letting me know that they disapprove of the book. Sadly, it's young men. And there are a few common factors. Like, firstly, the accounts that they send things from. This is like really 2 or 3 of them. I suspect maybe it's just the one person, but the account is anonymous and they've been set up just for trolling. So that's interesting. And then they always mention, I don't know why you would say this, but they always mention not reading the book. They're like, I saw the title of your book. I'm not going to read it because it's disgraceful. And I'm like, well, I can't take you seriously.
Because you haven't read
I wrote a book. And I put my name and my identity to this book. You're not doing that. You're like hiding behind a social media account. And also, you're saying I didn't read the book. So how would you know? You know, and I don't think that reading the book would change that person's mind. I think they'd be looking for things. But I find that really interesting. I have heard third hand from friends about people who aren't like pleased with taboo topics being out in the open, or who say that they feel the men in the community aren't represented well. And it kind of amazes me that a work that doesn't center men, that isn't 100% about how great all the men are, is then seen as being 100% critical and unfair to men. There seems to be a lot of fear of our like model minority status being shattered by acknowledging that we still have things to work on. And it's just not true. Like, you don't have to look far into my novels to find the good men. They exist. But I'm focusing on the women, you know, because there aren't that many narratives about women and about marginalized women. Somehow people feel like, because I write about some people who don't respect or value women, I'm somehow misrepresenting all of us. But in a way, the people who want to cover up the book are kind of doing exactly what their fictional counterparts are doing. You know, they're doing exactly what I say they do in the fictional world. They're kind of proving me right. My take on that sort of criticism is there are people who are doing these things. I'm simply writing about it. And there's this idea that it's airing dirty laundry, you know, and I think that's a really dangerous idea, because the fact is the dirty laundry exists. things like domestic violence or women and girls not being treated equally, forced marriages, caste prejudice. And yet I have yet to see the same level of outrage directed towards the perpetrators of those things. Like the amount of energy spent on trying to deplatform or silence a writer could be much better used addressing these issues. But maybe that's like more difficult and more complex than criticizing. Like maybe it's just easier to criticize than to be like, you know what? Maybe we should look inward. Like maybe we should stop doing or supporting the perpetrators or covering things up. Instead, it's easier to be like, hey, you, stop writing about it. Stop talking.
Yeah, stop talking about it. You're disgracing the community.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that really ties into this larger narrative, right, in brown communities that I see in my work that, you know, what happens at home stays in the home. We don't talk about what's going on in the home with someone else or people outside. And I think we can apply that to larger community, right? Like we don't showcase, like you said, our dirty laundry for the world to see and read.
Yeah. And I think that's really dangerous because it just silences people.
Yeah.
It allows perpetrators to get away with whatever they want. Because of this idea of like, you'll bring shame upon the family. How many people have not reported domestic violence? How many kids have not reported abusive parents or step-parents because they're like, oh, I'm afraid of bringing shame upon my family. It's incredibly dangerous.
Yeah, and it's usually women, right? Like this honor is bestowed upon us to carry the family's name and reputation for the rest of our lives. Yeah. And I think that's why it was so refreshing to see all the older women, the aunties, like later on in life, find that like sense of empowerment and community and this like sense of liberation.
I do find that like in my experience of like meeting older Punjabi women, I feel like they've just been through so much by the time they're in their 70s and 80s that they actually do have very like quite progressive views about things. Like some of them will be like, yeah, you know, if things aren't working out, just get divorced. Like some of them will say that because they're like, life is too short, and I've I've loosened up on my views because I've seen a lot of stuff. And all that preserving of honor, like what did that do for anyone? You know, like you don't want to be 70 or 80 and being unhappy. I've seen so much of that. So yeah, do as you wish. I've seen a lot of grandparents talk like that, and it's really interesting. It's really impressive that they come so far.
Yeah, I think it can make some people even more sort of like rigid and bitter. But I think, you know, this like sense of resentment that I went through it and, you know, I had to do it, so why don't you have to do it? But I think you're right. It also has the opposite impact on a lot of other people, right? That they can just say, well, you know, I did everything. I followed all the rules and didn't really get me much. So, you know, do whatever you want.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think there's that change and movement, right, in the community as well. I was really curious about the backlash in the community because I know that obviously like these like erotic classes, not classes, but like the writing classes about erotic stories, right? They happen in the Gurudwara, and I was really curious if you got any comments about that setting.
No, not specifically. Again, like people have said, you know, they stopped at the title when I don't want to read it. But also like I don't know if this makes too much of a difference, but it's the community center outside the Gurudwara. So it's kind of like on the grounds of the I can see how there will be people who will be like, oh, this is not appropriate to like, you know, put this center this in the Gurudwara. But it's kind of like in a center, I suppose, that the Gurudwara is kind of part of. I mean, if we're going into like the semantics of things. No, it hasn't. That hasn't come up. And maybe it might.
I think because, like you said, right, people kind of criticizing the book are just like they stop at the title.
They're like, I won't get into the finer details because I've decided that I don't want to read it. I've decided I know what it's about. So.
Yeah. But it sounds like the majority of the feedback has been quite positive.
Very positive, and really not from the people that you'd expect. Like I expected women, you know, to reach out, and they did. But like older Sikh men have written to me, like uncles have written to me from Punjab. I've had a lot of actually very good feedback from India, like from people in Punjab. A number of. I did get one Facebook message once from someone and it was really special. It was a guy who said, I have sisters and I have a mother, and I always thought that I knew like by default how to treat them, but after reading your book, I'm seeing everything differently. And I went, oh my
Wow.
God, that's like that's like the best thing I could hope for. It
Yeah.
was, the messages like that go a long way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because I think we see older women in general, and especially brown older women, mostly very like as asexual,
Yeah,
right? And I mean, if you think about it, there in many families within the Punjabi culture, there isn't so much of like a physical affection that we see between our parents, right, or our
yeah,
grandparents or anything. So you can very easily grow up with this notion that oh, they're just asexual, like they don't have any needs besides just providing for me.
they're kind of seen as like being subsidiaries or like being there to serve others. And that was what I really wanted to remove from these characters. I wanted them to just
Mm,
exist as individuals.
yeah, I love that. I love that. And even all of your other works, I know you really focus on some really socially challenging subjects like mental health, sexuality, mother-in-law, daughter-in-law dynamics. Um, and I think it really helps to see these dynamics like play out in fiction because I think we've
Yeah,
received a very specific, very rigid view through media, through movies, through TV shows about a lot of these dynamics. And there isn't so much of a different narrative.
yeah.
It's just like the bad mother-in-law or like the
Hmm.
spoiled daughter-in-law. Like there isn't like complexity to these
Yeah,
dynamics that we see. And so that's why I like really appreciated reading a lot of your work because it helped introduce a new way of looking
yeah,
at some of these like roles.
yeah, yeah. That was a big priority for me. I think,
Mm,
especially like I think when you're writing, when you're one of the only people writing about a particular community, um, and writing it for the rest of the world to see,
yeah.
you really want to make sure that you do justice to your representations of things and people,
Yeah.
um, and that that you create dimension, I suppose, and that you don't
Dimension.
just kind of go along with narratives that already exist. I feel like you have an opportunity to complicate things a little bit. Yeah,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that we're a dynamic group. We're just not as like, simplistic as sometimes
yeah,
like
yeah.
media makes out to be. Yeah, because when I remember even when I was growing up, like the only brown character that I saw on TV was like Apu from Simpsons
I
or,
know. I know. We
like
just had the worst, or like Mind Your, I don't know if you guys had Mind Your Language, that awful show. Like,
no, I don't think
just
so.
have that. It was very like, it was like a British show about this British man who's like teaching English to all these
Mm,
foreigners, and there's a Sikh character, there's a Pakistani character, and they can't get along.
mm,
And like, but like, my parents like gathered, like we all gathered to watch that every week because
mm,
there was no brown representation on TV. So if that was what you're gonna get, then okay.
mm,
Like yes, it was stereotypical. Yes, like, today we'd be like, what is this?
mm,
But back then it was like, well, that's something.
mm-hmm. Yeah. It was something, and I'm gonna take it. I'm gonna take whatever representation,
Yeah, yeah. Even
right,
up
that
from
I'm
The
getting.
Simpsons, I was like, he's such a
Yeah,
caricature, but he's something.
yeah.
So I'm glad that we don't have to do that so much anymore.
No. Yeah, now we have some well-represented shows and characters and
Yeah,
movies. Yeah,
exciting.
100%, 100%. Because I think you really internalize, right, a lot of this and
Yeah,
how you show up in the world. It's really easy to internalize and start stereotyping people.
yeah,
And I know as a brown community, and it's brown communities that live outside of like South Asia, we carry a lot of internalized racism as well. There's a lot of internalized shame. There's,
yeah,
a lot of us see value in proximity to whiteness. So
yeah.
it's really important to kind of like own our identities. And, so obviously I absolutely love everything that you write about. But one of the things I was really curious about was um, what you would want to say to someone who's an aspiring writer, because creative work traditionally, typically in our communities, like you said, is not something that's really encouraged, right? It's sort of like, okay, well, if you want to be an artist, do it on the side, but learn to go to med school, right? That's like your main thing and your main job. And so our creative passions and pursuits really, really get squashed really early on. And I know you've kind of, like you mentioned, you've had like your own journey through this. And I guess so many of the people that I work with now, or just in my personal life, I see so many of us who have all of these like creative aspirations, but we often get really like stuck between what we want for ourselves and what we're told we need and we should want. So I'm just wondering, what advice would you want to give to like a listener who's stuck in this space?
I think we need to go back to the idea of selfishness that holds a lot of us back. The idea of like other people calling us selfish, and really reframe that or rephrase that. Like, I think that's a very easy weapon to use against a child who's like not obeying, right? Like what the, and not going along with what the parents want. Or a wife who's not, going at the way her husband wants to do things. I think we need to consider that word is so weaponized, and think about the fact that it's not selfish. It's absolutely not selfish to act in your interests before others, to put your interests ahead of others. It doesn't mean that you are completely, it's not absolute. You're not, completely dismissing what other people say. Like, I'm quite grateful in a sense for the pragmatism that I was raised with, because I didn't graduate from college and become a starving artist. I knew, like, I was like, I have to have a plan B, and I have to develop like a career that has a salary, and that, like, I have to do more so I can support myself. And then I can kind of prove myself in this creative arena, because like that side is taken care of. I'm not a burden on anyone. So like no one can hold that against me and say, oh, you're just dragging everyone down with this creative pursuit of yours. So you can do that, and you can still follow your creative pursuits. But if the thing that you're being asked to do is being prescribed for you, like if it's a kind of a vague thing of like, you know what, you can be an artist, but you need to support yourself, I think that's fair. I think that's very fair. I don't think that's just brown parents. I think most parents would say that to their kid, right? Like, I don't want you living in my basement until you're 40. I think that's fair. But if the thing that's prescribed for you is like, you will be an engineer or you will be a doctor, then you need to really step back and be like, okay, do I want to commit this much of my life and this much of my identity towards making somebody else happy? And for what reason? For prestige? Like, do they want me to be a doctor because they want me to be helping people, or do they want to be telling the community that their son or daughter is a doctor? So really thinking about that. And again, just going back to the idea of like, is it really selfish of me to live my life for myself? And not completely, not absolutely for myself, but at least put it at the top of the list, especially for women. Women are always told to put other people's needs first. And they're always told to put their roles first, their daughter, wife, mother. So, just thinking, just reframing that, I think is so powerful.
Yeah, this idea of duality, right? That you can want something that's more stable and traditional while at the same time nourishing this creative part of you. Like, you don't have to rigidly pick one or the other and stick to it. Yeah. I think, like you said, especially for brown women too, right? Like, we're subservience, silence, suffering, all of these things are really appreciated, very socially rewarded, right? And
sacrifice.
Yeah.
Sacrifice is it's funny because it's not even rewarded that much. It's just so expected. And it's praised in a really shallow way. It's like, oh, look, she made so many sacrifices. But then it just leads to more sacrifices. It's like when you have a job and you do really well at the job and the other people on the team slack off because they're like, she does the job pretty well. And you just get more responsibilities and more work because you're the one who's staying there late. It's like that. It's that daughter, wife, mother role is similar if you're trapped in that kind of cycle of just being the sacrificer.
Yeah, and people pleaser, right? Because that's essentially like waving everybody else's flag but your own. And that often becomes a way of surviving, I think, in a lot of our communities. And then you get to your late 20s, early 30s, mid 30s, and you go, oh, I did everything that I was supposed to do, and I still feel unhappy.
Yeah. And there's still more to do. Like
Yeah.
those expectations don't let up. They just keep coming. The goalposts keep moving.
Yeah, 100%.
I remember that was a real realization, I think in my late 20s. I was like, oh, it's never going to be enough. So I better start doing things for me.
Yeah, I got the right grades. I didn't date boys. I went to the right university. I got the right master's. I got the right job. I got the promotion.
Yeah.
It's just,
Still not
it's
good
never
enough.
ending. No, it's not good enough. Right. You got to keep doing more. And I think it's okay to want the best for your children. But I think when within our communities, we get so wrapped up and obsessed with the idea of doing more and more and more.
Yeah.
That's really exhausting.
And I really question as well what's best for the children. I question that to some degree, because there's so much of like, what's best for my children is what's best for my reputation. And that's something I really push hard against. Because like I said, I've mentioned before, I worked at a high school that had a lot of, Asian kids and a lot of Indian kids. And there was this like real kind of gap between like kids' abilities sometimes and like what the parents wanted for them. Like, no, he will go to medical school. And it's like, well, his abilities aren't there. He's 17. He's not going to catch up to that right now. But it was like, no, that's the only path. Like, we migrated here. That's the only path. I've told everyone that he's going to be a doctor. There was no kind of flexibility and understanding just how many, like, your kid is great. Your kid is wonderful. Your kid is good at so many things. And your kid will thrive and survive because you are good parents, and you've given them the tools, and we have helped give them the tools. But instead it was like, no, there's this one definition of success.
Yeah.
And he has to meet that or it's over.
Doctor, lawyer, engineer, or failure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
It's a big one. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But yeah, I like this. I think doing that inner work to kind of find your happy medium. Right. Yeah. And it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of self-reflection, and it's constantly like shifting over time. But I think that's a great place to start. Yeah. Wow. Well, I've had a lot of fun chatting with you.
Me too.
Today, Balli.
This gave me a lot to think about.
Did it? Okay, I'm so glad. Yeah. No, I think this was really lovely. Thank you so much for making the time. And for anyone listening, you want to check out some of Balli's works, I will have everything linked down below, including her website and her Instagram. Check her out, and stay tuned for our disclaimer.
The guest and the host of Brown People Problems do not offer individualized therapeutic or medical advice, and our conversations should not be interpreted as such. This podcast is not a replacement for therapy. This podcast exists for educational purposes only. Please consider your circumstances and engage with the content mindfully.